Hi, Martin Baker here again for part 2 of the series on the Ephesians and Ephesus. Last week I showed you this, which was the subject of why Ephesus appeared in the Bible, and I told you that there was 3 letters to do with Ephesus from Paul and the Ephesians. Actually, I was wrong. There are actually 6 letters. After doing a bit of research, I found that John wrote the 1 John, 2 John and 3 John whilst in Ephesus to the churches around Ephesus and to the Ephesians. So, first I'd like to start talking quickly about Paul's second journey. This was a very short time in Ephesus. He was staying in Corinth for about a year and a half, and he travelled to Ephesus in the spring of 52 AD with a married couple, Jewish, called Aquila and Priscilla. They were actually tent makers, and Paul stayed with them in Corinth for the year and a half and worked with them making tents and preaching the gospel. But he wanted to go back to Jerusalem, which is down here, so he needed to take a ship. Of course, most ships in that period would have gone to Ephesus because that was the major trading hub. So he jumped on a ship, got to Ephesus with Priscilla and Aquila, and waited for another ship to take him down to Caesarea. But while he was there, he did a bit of preaching. He left Priscilla and Aquila there. Now, the interesting thing about those two is actually they were from Rome originally. And in about AD 49, they were kicked out of Rome by the Emperor Claudius, who expelled all Jews from Rome around that period. So that's the reason why they were there in Corinth and were happy to move with Paul to Ephesus. So Paul moved on and went to Jerusalem. But as I said, he was only there for a very short time. So we get to his third journey, which started in Antioch, and then he went to Ephesus purposely because of what was going on there. So he lived there for almost 3.5 years. He spoke at the synagogue for quite a while, but they didn't receive him very well. So he moved to the school of Tyrannus, which is in one of the main streets of the city of Ephesus itself, along one of the major roads. This is Ephesus that he would have walked into. Up here, you'll see a stadium. It's a Greek style, so it's U-shaped rather than the Roman Colosseum, which is more rounded. That road then leads down here to the main theatre, and then down here down to the harbour. Down this road here, there's a library of Celis. Next to that was actually the school of Tyrannus. And it's where Paul would have actually spoken most of his and taught most of his time there. Next to that, there's a brothel, a bath, a public toilet, another temple. It goes up this road till you get right up here where that was the water palace. That's where the aqueduct brought in all the water for the city and distributed it down through the baths and the wells and the fountains where people got their water every day. But that's the basic layout of Ephesus during that time. The original Ephesus, of course, was built behind this hill, and that's where the temple is. And this area here was actually the foreshore. So all this land has been filled in by the sea and by silt. So, the Grand Theatre. I'm sure you've read this time that in Acts 19, 23 to 41, about the mob that grabbed 2 of Paul's travelling companions and brought them to this theatre. Most of the people in that theatre at the time didn't even know what was going on. They were it must have been a bit of excitement for the day, so they just joined it. So Paul wanted to go in, but he was stopped by the people around him because they were afraid that they would either injure him or kill him. But another one of Paul's companions, Alexander, went into the crowd and to try and speak to them and defend what Paul was doing and what the people there. Because what had happened is Paul's preaching was so effective, So effective, not just in Ephesus, but in all of Asia Minor, that people were turning away from the old gods and they were not buying the little statues of Artemis or little badges of the shrines around the areas, and that was affecting the revenue of the silversmiths and the other craftsmen in that area. But once Alexander tried to get up and speak, he experienced cancel culture in the first century AD. It's nothing new. It's certainly nothing new in the 21st century. Every time he tried to speak, they would shout, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And they shouted that for over 2 hours. Every time he tried to speak. They didn't want to hear his arguments. They didn't care what he had to say. They just wanted them to shut up. Well, they finally quelled that, but Paul realised that it was probably not best to hang around for too long with that sort of thing going on. He was certainly a target. And so he decided to return to Jerusalem. So Paul left the city. That would have been about the winter of 57 AD. But when he left a very strong, growing church. They were quite evangelistic and were going out building new churches around the area. But after a while, Paul was hearing reports that things weren't going that well, that there was trouble. But so he wrote them a letter in about 62 AD, the letter to the Ephesians, which we are going through. But he also asked Timothy to stay in Ephesus to further strengthen and correct the church. So Timothy stayed there for a while and did a good job of actually moving things along. But they weren't the only notables who were there. It's interesting that John, the apostle of Jesus, was also there, and at least twice. John originally went there about 41 AD, owing to the persecution of Herod Agrippa. You'll see that in Acts 12, 1-23. But he also, from what the historical accounts that there are, probably took Mary, the mother of Jesus, with him to keep her safe while the persecution was going on. But at some point after 44 AD, they moved back to Jerusalem, where Mary died. But there's very little evidence that John actually had any great impact on the city of Ephesus. There was no evangelism that we could see from the records. Paul certainly didn't mention it in Ephesians. Luke didn't mention it in Acts. And there was nothing referenced to him in the letters that Paul wrote to Timothy. So he may have not done a great deal there because Mary was quite aged by that point, probably in her 60s. Which was elderly for that time and was probably spending his whole time looking after her. But that's my pure conjecture. So John's back in Jerusalem, but then the first Jewish war started, one of the rebellions, and led to the destruction of the temple. So very early on in that, John moved back to Ephesus, and he was certainly there from about 66, 65 AD, until he was taken and sent to exile in Patmos by the Emperor Domitian. Now, it was interesting because actually John was taken from Ephesus to Rome and plunged into a boiling cauldron of oil, but he actually suffered no ill effects from that. And that's when Domitian decided the best thing to do was to exile him to Patmos. And in Patmos, of course, John wrote Revelations, which we'll talk about next time. So after Domitian died, his successor, Nevar, released John, and John returned to Ephesus in about 95 AD. That's where he certainly wrote the letters, 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. There is some controversy about 1 John, about who actually wrote it, but you can attribute it to John himself. It's a constant theme. Most of them are written about troubles within the church, about the heresies that were going on, about troublemakers within the church, about pride, and quite a few other things that were happening around that time. I mean, John was certainly very active. I mean, he'd be in his 80s and he was still travelling around these churches. And you see that certainly in 2 John 1:12 and 3 John 1:10 and 1:14, that he was actually going to visit a lot of these places that were in and around Ephesus. At his later part in life, in his 90s, he was actually carried into church most days on a stretcher, where he would still preach about the love of Christ. He eventually died in around AD 100, aged between 93 and 94. So next week, I'm going to talk to you about Revelations, about what the prophecy that Jesus gave to John about the church in Ephesus and its final outcome. Till then, have a great week. Bye.